Today, the DJI FPV drone review, the cons and things that you do need to know before you buy one. Hey guys, Felix here with Quadcopterguide, and on this channel I help you get the most out of your drones and other camera gear. Today we're talking about the DJI FPV drone, and today we're going to talk about the cons and kind of the negatives that I've found so far, and also some things that you really should consider before plunking down a good amount of change to get yourself into the system. In my previous video, which I'll link up here and in the description below, you can see kind of the first part of this review if you haven't seen it, and that sweet intro. Then I recommend you watch that. Pause this one, watch that, and then come back here. Today we're going to talk about the things that you need to know that you might not see in other reviews. All right, so first, from a beginner's perspective, you're going to get into FPV. Maybe this is your first FPV drone, and this thing is very cool as a first FPV drone just because of those features I talked about in the previous video. But on that same point, in that same sentence, we have to mention that FPV drones will have ground contact sometimes when you don't want it to. You will crash at some point. Maybe the first time you're flying in manual mode, maybe once you start to get a little bit more daring and trying new things. And so naturally we should look at the build quality. Now the DJI FPV drone, as you might know, is not made of carbon fiber. This is actually plastic used on the arms. Now if you look at a traditional FPV drone, this one I built, it's also available as a bind and fly. This is the Diatone Roma F5 DJI version with the DJI Air unit. As you can see, this is made out of carbon fiber. Very strong and lightweight. Now, if you were to crash super hard and break an arm, they are replaceable. You can get them relatively inexpensively. And let's say you do crash with the DJI FPV drone. At the time of this recording, you cannot buy parts for this online. Now, there is some good news about crashing that I found so far, so that's good. But just know that if you do crash and you break an arm, if you break it here, that's not too terrible because this is kind of made modular, and you can just unscrew some of these things, or DJI in the service center can unscrew some of these things and give you a new arm, which will have a new motor on it as well. Check out this. I found a couple of guys that have already crashed their DJI FPV drones. They sent them into DJI. They did not use the DJI Care Refresh. That's another topic for another day. And I was surprised by the sum. One guy got this arm replaced and the shell, and with labor, the whole bill was around $87 US. Now you might think, oh, these carbon fiber parts on this one are way cheaper and you can do it yourself. Okay, I got you there, but I expected this to be a lot more expensive to fix. Based on the price of the DJI Care Refresh and the fee you have to send it in, and the fee that they charge to send it in and get you a replacement, I'm glad to see that the repair costs are relatively manageable. One guy had just one arm replaced, and I think he paid $47 plus minus shipping. Not that huge of a deal in my opinion. So that's at least good news on that front. Now, I don't know how tech savvy you are. I don't know if parts will be available for this at a later date. I don't know if you have to solder wires or they're just plug and play. Just know that if you crash currently, you do have to send it into DJI. They have to fix it. And of course, while your drone is not in your hands, you got nothing to fly. It is what it is. Just keep that in mind. All right, so now from a more intermediate viewpoint, how is this DJI FPV drone for the kind of intermediate FPV pilot? Maybe you already fly FPV, either analog or digital with the DJI FPV system. How is it from that viewpoint? So one thing I'd like to comment on is the feel of the transmitter. Now, granted, this is a transmitter that doesn't cost hundreds and hundreds of dollars. I think if you calculate it out or if you buy it separately, it's under 200 bucks. So your expectations should be in line with that. But one thing I found is these 3 position buttons or switches, you can move them quite a bit before they click. Now, I don't know if that's just because it's new and it'll kind of get smoother with time, but that's just something I've noticed. And also the sticks are, of course, pretty short, just because these sticks have to fit somewhere for storage if you're on the go. I prefer longer sticks, and I'll show you what I mean by that in a second. Now, one thing that I found curious is when you open up this back shell here to tighten these screws to get rid of the return to center on the throttle stick, you might do the same thing I did initially. You tighten all those Allen bolts or screws as much as you can to get rid of the return to center. Now when you do that, there's a very strong kind of tension on the stick, kind of friction actually. Friction is a better word for it. It makes it very kind of almost not difficult, but you need to push it quite strongly to get it to do its thing, and it's also kind of loud. Right now I've got it adjusted and you can still hear it. Anyhow, I got back home, I messed with it quite a bit, and I adjusted it an eighth of a turn at a time until I got it to where I like it. If you do it too much the other way, it can actually feel too loose, in my opinion, but I've got it to set exactly to where I want it with a little bit of friction and definitely zero return to center. So that's a tip for you there. Now that remote is definitely going to feel a lot different than something like this. This is a dedicated remote for all my FPV drones. This happens to be the Jumper T16. The better version of this now out is the Radio Master, etc., etc. But this does have Hall effect gimbals. So as you can see, I can adjust the stick length. I've got it a little bit shorter here, just for storage. I've got a case for it that's relatively flat, so I can't have them super long, but you can make them even longer than this. And this thing is just smooth. There's no other way to describe it. Very smooth, and you can be very precise. If you're a thumber, you can still toss the sticks around. For somebody that pinches like me, I really, really enjoy this style of radio. And of course, the throttle is very, very smooth, and of course does also not return to center. So this thing cost me less than that DJI remote. Of course, this does not work with the DJI FPV drone, but I can get it to work with my custom built drones like this one. I just have to solder an extra receiver on board and then override the receiver, I guess, in the air unit, or just not use it. That's what I do for all my self-built quads based on a DJI FPV system. And, you know, it will most likely never ever work with this. You know, if you're considering building your own or buying a bind and fly package, just know that there is a difference between a radio like this, also with limited buttons, and a radio like this where you can program almost anything on there. Now, there are some cons with doing that. There's no emergency pause button, which in my previous video I covered in detail, so make sure you check out that video if you don't know what that is. Okay, so let's talk about flying characteristics. This thing is heavy. There's just no getting around that. It comes in at just under 800 grams, 795 grams, of course with the battery. A typical 5-inch quad with the battery comes in at what, 400, 450-ish grams, something like that. That is what, half or maybe just over half of the weight of the DJI FPV drone. And that is noticeable when you're flying around. There's just no getting around it. You can't cheat physics. And so, yes, the battery life is pretty good if you're slowly cruising around. If you're doing full freestyle, you're still only going to get 5 to 7 minutes of flight time out of this. Now, if you want to know the details of prop wash, how each one compares, then you can look at a channel like Bardwell's, for example. For the weight, this thing flies pretty good. That's just fact. Now, if you want the most perfect prop wash handling and the ultra smoothest footage, then you're probably not going to go with the DJI FPV drone. It is excellent for getting started, don't get me wrong. And yes, you might crash and have to send it into DJI. In the long run, having that emergency pause button will be a very, very useful and hopefully a feature that will keep you out of trouble. If you know you're going to stick with FPV, then the choice is a little bit more difficult. Do you go with something like this? Do you go with a Cinewhoop where the props are protected even more? I'll link another video I did of a Cinewhoop up here. It's difficult. For the ultimate beginner, if you're flying a Mavic or a DJI camera drone, you can't do much wrong with going with the DJI FPV drone. If you can see yourself building one of these and you don't mind tinkering and messing about and figuring out why the on-screen elements don't show up right, etc. You don't need the emergency pause button, you don't need obstacle avoidance, then you can consider that. I would still recommend this to someone looking to try FPV or get into FPV. Just know that this will probably not be your last FPV drone. All right, so let's talk about the camera. I must say, when I first flew this thing, I had electronic image stabilization on and the lens distortion turned off. I was surprised that I could still see the props in the footage written to the onboard memory card. That is one of those things, it's kind of difficult to change on something like this. I guess you could crop in on the video some more. With the onboard stabilization, you have to crop it in probably quite a bit, because as the stabilization kind of smooths things out, sometimes you see a little bit more, sometimes you see a little bit less props, but it is what it is. You're probably not going to change it on here. On other drones like this 5-inch, if the camera is mounted more forward, you will not get props in your view. And there's so many different frames. Some are laid out to be made for kind of cinematic freestyle. Now there are lots of different frames you can choose from. You don't have to choose this one. You can do your research and make sure that the props are not in your view based on the GoPro setting that you use, on how wide the camera setting is. But I was a little surprised that you do get to see the props in the footage of the DJI FPV drone. Now, speaking of stabilization, the DJI FPV drone, of course, does onboard electronic image stabilization, rock steady, and with that, it stabilizes the footage as you're flying around. Of course, there's a mechanical one-axis gimbal for up and down smoothing about when you do lots of frequent changes. The gimbal will help you out there, but the stabilization you get is what you get. There's no changing it. With something like this, featuring a GoPro, that's my go-to camera. I've got an old GoPro 6, and it happens to be one of the best cameras for FPV because the way it saves its gyro data in the video file, you can use a software called RealSteady, which I've got linked down below, to smooth out that footage. And a lot of the FPV footage before the release of the DJI FPV drone was stabilized with this RealSteady program. I even made a video about it. You can check that out up here or down below as well. So it gives you more flexibility. I would love to have the gyro data out of this drone and be able to stabilize my footage after the fact. That would be a sweet feature. Of course, you might need a locked gimbal mode for that, just because with the gimbal moving around and then stabilizing the gyro data based on the gyro data after the fact, that could get kind of confusing, and I'm not quite sure if that would get you the results that you want. But as it is, you get the footage you get out of there, and that's what you're stuck with. So this might sound very nitpicky, but for the kind of nerd among us and the person that wants the best possible footage, that is one of the things you have to decide if you want to go built or bind and fly with the traditional FPV route or the DJI FPV drone. Don't forget, when you're comparing price, the building equipment. If you don't have a decent soldering iron, I encourage you to get a good one right off the bat. It'll save you headaches later on and down the road. Don't forget, you have to get a LiPo charger. That all this stuff comes in the drone ready to go, or with the drone if you buy the DJI FPV drone. So just keep that in mind when you make sure you compare apples to apples. Don't forget that this thing with the air unit version 1 at least, maybe we'll see an air unit version 2 very soon, it can only record in 1080p. So if you want 4K footage and you want to stabilize that footage after the fact, guess what? You're buying a GoPro if you don't have one already, so keep that in mind as well. And for those that want the ultimate best results, don't forget to consider that you will probably be buying RealSteady. I've got a coupon down below actually, ting! So if you do buy it and you want to help out the channel, then feel free to check it out with the link down below. All right, so there's some of the cons and things that you need to know about the DJI FPV drone. If you're on the fence going, do I want to go self-built or bind and fly, kind of the old school way with more tinkering and adjusting and things, or do I just want something that's ready to go? It's tuned out of the box. Yes, there's a little bit more things you have to do. If you do crash it, it will cost you a little bit more to fix. But like I said in the video, the prices I've seen so far, I have been honestly impressed with. I thought it was gonna be a lot more expensive to get this thing fixed if you send it into DJI. You have to make a decision. Is that something for you? Is it not something for you? Do let me know down below. I really want to know, what do you think? If you're on the fence, you want to get into FPV, currently with the knowledge you have, would you go DJI FPV drone? Or would you go with something like this, a 5-inch or any kind of other FPV drone. You don't have to get something as high-end as this. There's excellent lower-priced drones out there to get you started to see if you like it. You don't have to spend a ton to get into it. You can even get analog gear for very cheap these days. But if you are going to stick with it, if you think this is going to be something you're into, then I do encourage you to go digital. I have not regretted going into the DJI FPV system. The digital image is very, very fantastic. And if you're used to flying Mavics or camera drones, then you're used to the digital image, so you don't want to downgrade, do you? All right, can't wait to see what you guys have to say. And in the meantime, check out some of these other videos. I've got 2 options here for you. This one's pretty good, but hey, why don't you check out that one? All right, see you guys next time. Bye.